Plus, mostly they're Japanese. There's a couple of English, but
I'm not sure.
I'm just going to go to the bathroom.
Just respondents goes to verify the political situation, influence the decision on rivers and streams, which then goes into rivers and then goes into the ocean.
Take the lead? Okay. If you agree, we'll have 3 separate table conversations rather than one large group, and then towards the end, we'll just come together. Does that sound reasonable? Okay?
Great.
Fine.
I've got this table.
Okay.
So my name is
My
Jane.
name's Bob.
I grew up in Colorado, not close to the ocean, but then I fell in love with the ocean when I went to visit, and have been a marine biologist for most of my life.
Loss of biodiversity, destruction of forests, destruction of coral reefs.
I'm eager to hear what you are interested in.
Both of these two
I myself am interested in many different environmental issues. Climate change and biodiversity, but the health of the ocean. So, have you had some discussions about questions that you would like to ask? So, I'm all ears.
Alright, who wants to start? Who wants to start? I guess. Okay.
Looks like you were volunteering.
Yeah, I gotta read it up. But I'm not really educated enough with the ocean and its biodiversity, but I have a question about fossil fuels.
Yes.
And considering the fact that renewable sources are, they can only provide a small amount or a small percentage of our energy, and that nuclear power, is very expensive. How can we refrain or stop from using fossil fuels as soon as possible?
That is a fantastic question, and it really is one of the major challenges of today. One of the things that we've seen happen is that when renewable energy first started being used, whether it was solar energy or wind energy, it was very expensive. As more people became interested, the price came down, and there are benefits to producing lots and lots of solar panels. Per panel, it's cheaper to produce lots than a few. And so the cost of renewable energy has been going down and down and down. And that's one reason that it's become much more adopted around the world. Many of the challenges with renewables are figuring out ways to accelerate the use, to find what's appropriate for a place. Some places have a lot of sun, other places have a lot of wind, other places have a lot of tidal movement, so there are different types of renewables, and it has to be appropriate for the place. So renewables are becoming more and more available and cheaper, which is why you see so much more renewable energy being used. All forms of energy have trade-offs. There are some benefits and some detriments. We've learned that fossil fuels have huge environmental cost because they are changing the climate. They are relatively cheap now in terms of the price to use them, but the environmental cost to everyone is quite substantial. So it's become very clear we need to move away from fossil fuels as fast as possible. Nuclear energy has trade-offs, and Japan has had some very painful experiences with that. There's no one answer about whether it is good or not, and different countries around the world have chosen different paths with nuclear energy. Many experts see it as a transition option until we can get to more renewables. But that's a decision that each country has to make, and citizens should be part of that dialogue. In Germany, the government and the citizens have said, no, we will not use nuclear power. In France, they have said, yes, we think that on balance, this is a good choice for us. So there's no one right answer for all people everywhere. It's a question of balancing the pros and the cons. And that's a hard choice. It's a very hard choice because some of the consequences, they may not happen.
We just tell them what options they should at least
or they may happen. And so you're balancing some difficult things that are difficult to evaluate. What is your opinion? What do you think?
That's really hard.
It is hard.
But yeah, I don't know. Everything has a bad side.
Yeah. Yeah. Some bad is worse than others, though. And we know that fossil fuels are really, really bad. And the problem has been that the companies that make them don't want people to think about alternatives. And they don't want governments to be encouraging renewable energy or alternatives. So in my country, the fossil fuel industry has told many citizens that climate change is a hoax. And that's very, very dangerous because it's not true. And it makes the problem even worse. More and more Americans are seeing that the climate is changing because they're experiencing different types of weather, that extreme weather that they've never seen before. And so they're not believing what they're told, they're seeing something firsthand and are beginning to change their minds. Even though the President of the United States is in denial about climate change, the real action in the United States is communities and states who are taking strong action, many of them, to switch to renewable energy. So you might hear that the United States, that Trump has said we want to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, but that hasn't happened yet. He's just said he wants to, and sometimes he says one thing and then doesn't follow through. But more importantly, communities, cities, states, and regions, especially on the West Coast and in the Northeast, are taking very aggressive action to reduce carbon emissions and to use renewables. So there's a lot going on that you may or may not have heard about, but that I find encouraging, even though our president is making it more difficult than it should be.
But even if he says that he's going to pull out from the Paris Agreement, people can still go against him, right? Yes.
So pulling out of Paris is actually, there's a formal process for doing that, and it actually takes 4 years. So you can't just say, oops, we're out. There's a process that you have to go through. So it's not clear that what is going to happen. What is clear is that we no longer have a strong leader who is saying internationally and nationally, this is an important issue. President Obama said climate change is important, and he helped provide with other global leaders the momentum to create the Paris Agreement.
If we do not
So the United States is losing international leadership on the issue, which makes me unhappy because I think it's a very important issue. But the United States has not given up on the Paris Agreement yet.
We'll get more hurricanes or typhoons or cyclones.
Good question.
We've just said
Your turn.
I'm very interested in animal agriculture. Because I know
You're very interested in
animal agriculture.
Yes.
So I want to ask, but it's like the second part of the question. Do environmental groups like Greenpeace and WWF, do they actually understand like the problems with the environment, and are they actually making a difference? And are they making differences to protect the environment? And because a lot of them, they don't address the problem, or very vaguely address the problem of like the meat and animal agriculture industry. And even though it's like one of the most detrimental industries to the environment, and is that because like they're funded, or because they want to maximize the number of people making like contributions? Like I would like to hear your opinion.
I want to clarify what you're asking. When you talk about animal agriculture, are you talking about livestock, so cattle and sheep? That's what you're talking about, right?
It won't be the solution to climate change, but in many countries, nuclear power might be about 20%.
I don't know of positions that WWF have taken about that. So tell me more why you're concerned about environmental organizations like that.
I know that like meat and that like food, animal products are very bad for the environment, but a lot of organizations are funded by the industries, and so they actually say things on their site like you should eat it and stuff. But
and the third is you've got to be very, very careful not to lose any of the nuclear fuel.
In my experience, most environmental organizations choose a few topics that they care about particularly, and that's what they work on.
USA, Korea, France, England.
I don't know all of the policies of the organizations that you referred to.
So it's an interesting one. It is a clean energy.
What I would say is that animal agriculture does require a lot of, animal agriculture does have a lot of environmental impacts. Use of greenhouse gases and production of methane, but also use of a lot of water and a lot of land. And all of those have environmental consequences. I think what is important to think about is how do we make, what kind of choices, let me say this differently. I think there are two issues. One is how to make operations have a smaller environmental footprint. So how to minimize water use, minimize production of greenhouse gases, use of greenhouse gases, minimize production of methane, but also how to balance across the different food choices that people have, how to encourage people to think about the environmental consequences of their own food choices so that they can make an informed decision. And what is clear is that eating lower in the food web, so eating more plants, has lower environmental consequences.
dolphins,
eating
sharks
more
in
and
particular.
more
Sharks are now
chicken
threatened.
and then even more
Again,
beef
because
has
of
greater
overeating
environmental
fish,
consequences.
Sharks.
Some of my colleagues have done some recent calculations that are not yet published
When we
that
do
tell
eat
us
some of these fish,
that
we do have to be careful. Some
eating
do have high levels of mercury,
seafood
as you say, which is not
has
good.
much lower
However, you do
environmental
have to eat a huge
consequences
amount of fish
than
before those
eating
mercury
any
levels are likely to
farmed animals
So one
from
just
the
has to be
land.
careful about it, especially
Doesn't like seafood doesn't like I feel like by kill or by catch.
By catch?
so it's definitely
Any type of food choices has some consequence. We can do a better job of minimizing the environmental footprint of all of them,
which seem to have
but there are
better
also
conditions
choices to be
for
made
their
across
dolphins, or better conditions
food from the
for
sea,
their lions,
food
their
from land,
tigers, their elephants.
within
But it
land,
is a tricky
plants
one. So
versus,
we humans have the right to keep an animal captive. The
animals.
trouble is that many of these animals
And
are
I
losing
think
their
I
natural
agree with
habitat.
what I agree with what I think you're saying, which is consumers need to have more information about the consequences of their food choices so they can make smarter decisions. And I think that's
It's an
absolutely correct.
interesting question. So for example,
My question is,
there'll be a circus, it comes.
And he has a very loud voice. I need to speak more loudly so that I can hear you.
okay, got it. Okay.
He's very passionate.
So I understand that saving our Earth requires contribution from all kinds of people, but within our population there are many people that do not believe in climate change. So what do you say to people that don't believe in climate change, and how do environmental scientists convince and persuade other people to believe and start making changes in their patterns of life?
That's a really good question and a very tough one.
In a small space when it really is used
Are
to
you
being
thinking
an
mostly
open
about people in
ocean.
Japan or people around the world?
Around the world generally.
It's a tricky one.
This may surprise you, but I don't think talking to them about the scientific evidence is the right place to start. I think a better place to have a conversation with people is to talk about values and to find some common ground about some values that you share. And then to work back from that and talk about choices that we make and how it affects other people in other places now and how it affects people in the future, how our choices affect those. There is abundant evidence from science that the climate is changing and that the changes are largely due to human activities. There's just,
take a forest, we
the
cut some of
scientific
it down
community
to go
is
to
almost
agriculture.
unanimous about that.
Many of the main
But even
growth
with
swamps,
that
especially
evidence,
in Asia,
there are still many
have been
people
drained and turned
that
into
are
sheep
in
farms.
denial. And it's not
Most of
because
the forests in Europe
they
were
don't
destroyed hundreds of
even,
years ago
they don't
to
always
build
even
roads
know
and
the
cities.
scientific evidence,
So by
but they've
changing a
rejected it
forest to a
because it
grassland
conflicts with
or
their own
mangrove
personal
system,
beliefs about
we're
something.
basically losing
And
a
so
lot of
trying to
biodiversity.
argue about the
So
science
the first threat to
isn't really
biodiversity
very
is
productive
diversion
because that's not
of a
really the
natural
problem.
habitat into
So I
sort
think a
of
better
managed one like an agricultural
tack
farm,
is
a
to
shrimp farm, etc.
talk about values and find common ground and then talk about how do we get to that future, the world that we might both believe is an important one for us. I have a good friend in the United States who is a scientist, and she is an evangelical Christian. She's deeply religious, and many people that share her faith are in denial about climate change. And so she is in a very unique position where she can talk to other people that share her beliefs about climate change And she doesn't push the science at them and say, you've got to believe this, because this is what the science says. She takes the approach of talking about, caring about poor people, caring about taking good care of creation, in her view, God created all of biodiversity, and people have a responsibility to be good stewards. And so that's a value that she shares with them, and to talk about that value and to say that poor people are suffering the most from the extreme weather that we are having. A lot of biodiversity is being lost because of climate change. And then inviting a conversation with them about how can we work together to take care of poor people, to take care of God's creation in her language. So I think that's a different approach than just kind of trying to lead with the science, and might be useful as an alternate. What experiences have you had with that in Japan?
In Japan? Is it alright if I talk about the U.S.? Sure. I come from the U.S. Sure. So
where in the U.S.?
Mostly the West Coast. So I have relatives there, and most of them are really religious, but some don't believe in climate change, and I try to explain to them like it's important and you need to make changes in your life to save the environment, but they don't really believe me.
It's frustrating, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
So I was wondering like how do I persuade them in a better way in which they'll have to agree. Yep.
Many people just believe what they believe because someone else has told them that this is the way it is. And so if you can find ways to not confront them, not sort of argue with them, but to try to change the conversation to one of the extreme weather that people are seeing in the United States. I mean, on the West Coast, there are massive wildfires that are burning right now. We've got the Hurricane Harvey that just hit the Gulf Coast. We have Hurricane Irma that is heading, it's in the Caribbean islands and is headed probably toward Florida. We have two other hurricanes that are on either side of Irma. And we know that those really, really strong Category 4 or 5 hurricanes, we know that climate change doesn't cause hurricanes, but it can make them much more powerful and longer lasting. And we know that the ocean is much warmer than usual because of climate change. We know that the air is warmer, and the warmer air holds more water. So climate change is helping to create the conditions that are conducive to these big, massive, powerful hurricanes.
To stop overfishing, basically.
So I think that's an important nuance. I'm not saying that climate change causes those hurricanes, but it can create the conditions that make them more likely, and when they exist, climate change can make them more powerful.
And the cod stock went so low
so
the fishery industry collapsed. There just wasn't
we're seeing lots of drought around the United States. The drought, the wildfires, a lot of just other weird weather patterns, and that's just in the United States. And so talking to people about the weird weather and the more extreme weather that we're seeing can be a useful conversation. I know in my experience, more and more Americans are saying, what the heck is going on with the weather? It didn't used to be like this. And that, in fact, is beginning to open up new conversations about what might be causing it. So, good luck with that.
Yeah, thank you.
Do we only get one question?
Depends on how much time we have.
Okay. And so, so the chairman of the Asahi Glass Foundation was just talking about how humans can only see imminent dangers and they suffer to comprehend the dangers of long-term problems. And this is clearly applicable to climate change and harms to the ocean, because in Japan the fishing markets are blooming, and that is, it seems like these resources will always be around. But then in school, or at least our school, we learn about eutrophication and ocean acidification, and about how these species are going extinct in all these dead zones in the ocean. And so my question is, just taking the example of Japan, but how come it's so hard to see these clearly adverse effects? Like, how come it's not shown on television? And also, is it likely that companies and organizations will only begin to work towards preventing climate change when they begin to actually see these effects on their markets and on their staff?
Really excellent questions.
We're now telling companies, don't do it now.
This is another very complicated situation. Let's focus on the ocean for a moment. The ocean is so huge that people have thought it was impossible to deplete it. It's just immensely bountiful and infinitely resilient. And so for a long time there's been this mindset that there's nothing we can do to deplete the ocean. And fisheries have had a long history of overexploiting at this place, and then they just move on to another place and deplete that, and then move on to another one and deplete that. And so this, we call this sequential overfishing of one stock and then another and then another. And the problem is that was masking, it was hiding the reality of the depletion. Right now, so fast forward to the present, we've run out of new places to fish. We used to fish right close to the coastal areas, and then as technology allowed us to go farther and farther away from the coast, farther and farther into the Southern Ocean, and deeper, we've been successively eliminating one species, one stock after another, and we've run out of new places to go. That reality is becoming more and more obvious to fishermen and to fishery managers because of the global level of overfishing. There are now is much greater interest in fishery reform, in figuring out how to fish sustainably. We've seen examples of that in many places around the world, with some very encouraging successes. I can tell you from personal experience that reforming fisheries is really hard. It's really hard. But if you find the right fishermen leaders, the right government leaders, the right community leaders that can see a better future instead of worse and worse and worse and worse, they can see that there are some options to being smarter. We call it fishing smarter, not harder. There are ways to fish differently that can result in sustainable fisheries. In the United States, for example, we've done some massive reforms of fisheries, and the result has been pretty impressive. We've slashed overfishing by 60% from 2000 to 2016. In 2000, we had 92 stocks that were overfished, and we slashed that by 60%. So to 38, I think, is the number. Even more impressive is that we have been able to, with good fishery reform, rebuild the stocks that were depleted. So it is possible to have them come back. Lesson that we have learned is that it is possible, it's hard, but it is possible to reform fisheries, and it's absolutely worth it. And that experience, put together with experiences of a number of other countries, both developed and developing countries, northern, southern, there have been a number of good examples. There's now much more interest by many other countries of reforming fisheries. Japan has a lot of good aspects of its fisheries, but it also has some real problems. And the cabinet has just recently set up a new task force to discuss fishery reforms. So the government is having this conversation, they're involving the fishery scientists, they're involving fishermen, and part of what I've been doing the last few days is talking to a number of them and sharing lessons learned, because we can learn from you, you can learn from us. The other thing that's happening that you touched on is that businesses are now paying more attention. Some businesses. I've been working with a group of CEOs of the 10 largest seafood companies in the world, both wild capture fisheries and aquaculture. And they have decided to work together because they're very, very worried about climate change, ocean acidification, and overfishing. And they have been talking to a group of scientists and have decided that their future is at stake, and they're going to be better off if they work together and be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And so it's early in this conversation. We don't know this is going to work yet, but it's a very encouraging conversation that some of the biggest companies in the world, and some of them are Japanese companies, are now part of this conversation. This group is called SEABOS, S-E-A-B-O-S. It's an acronym. It stands for Seafood Businesses for Ocean Stewardship, or Ocean Sustainability, one or the other. So you can just Google S-E-A-B-O-S. And those companies are working with a group of scientists led by the Stockholm Resilience Center in Sweden, and I'm advising them. The CEOs are really concerned, they're really interested, and they will tell things to scientists that they might not say publicly. So I think it's useful to know that there are business leaders that are now paying attention and really wanting to do something. So we're getting closer and closer to some good changes in seafood practices and policies. We haven't reached the tipping point yet. There's still some very serious problems, but there's a lot of good stuff that's happening. And the trick is figuring out how to make it happen faster, how to scale up at a faster pace than before. You're up.
My question is, what kind of attempts did countries actually try to make the climate change better? All kind of stuff.
What kind of changes have they made to address climate change?
Yeah.
Some countries, like Japan, use energy very efficiently. There's not a lot of waste. Other countries, like the United States, are very wasteful. We just waste a lot of energy. And so one of the things that is happening in the United States is there's more and more interest in energy efficiency, using each unit of energy that is produced, using it much more efficiently and eliminate the waste. Other countries are focusing on the source of their energy and shifting from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And in the United States, there's been a huge change in interest in renewables, in the price of renewable energy is becoming more and more competitive. There's also been a switch from coal to natural gas. So within the category of fossil fuels, coal is much worse than natural gas in terms of its implication for climate change. So all those things are happening at the same time. You know, in the U.S. we have more energy efficiency, coal to gas, we have more renewables. So what's happening varies a lot from one country to another. What are the changes that you've seen in Japan with respect to energy and climate change? Well, there's a lot of conversation, for example, about nuclear and what role that has, and that's a very important conversation to be having.
I think that question came up because just a while ago we were reading about those conferences that failed to reach their sustainability goals, and so it caused some frustration, a degree of frustration in our class about what the government hasn't done, but we haven't focused a lot on what they have done. Yeah.
Well, you know, as part of the Paris Agreement, many countries made commitments to reduce their carbon emissions, and some are making better progress than others in doing that.
One for technology, one for international activities.
It's clear that we need to make even more progress than just what was in the Paris agreements. And that's something that Bob will touch on in his remarks, so you can listen really carefully when he talks about that. So we need to make not only the commitments that were made, but even more progress. And there is a need for countries, there's a need for monitoring and reporting so that everybody knows who's doing what. And there needs to be social pressure across countries so that they are holding each other accountable. One of the challenges is many of the developing countries made commitments that were contingent upon receiving funds from developed countries to help them make a transition to more renewable energy, for example, because it costs money to do the transition. And so one of the things that we are worried about is that the United States had promised a lot of money to help developing countries meet their Paris Agreement commitments. And that now may be at risk with President Trump. So we're very worried about that, and many of us are doing everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen. But that's a challenge for us. So thank you for that clarification.
Companies and governments succeeded in making solar panels and greenhouses. Then, like, I guess Earth is like kind of more, you know, getting worse, like as an environmental.
Are you saying that despite their efforts, we're not making progress as fast as we need? Is that what you're saying? So that's true, but it varies a lot from one place to another. You know, some countries are on a good pace. They're on track. Others not so much. And I think the part of the I think the part of what's really needed is not only for the business community and governments to be thinking about this issue, but young people and citizens more broadly. Governments and businesses are responsive to their citizens. They're responsive to consumers. And I think you all have more power than you actually realize to help effect the kinds of changes that you think need to happen. And if you are frustrated with the pace of change, don't give up. find ways to work together to make your voices heard. Because what happens has huge consequences for you guys. And what we have seen over and over is that people will listen to young people more than you might imagine, more than you think. And it's not just a single voice, but you have the power of numbers. And so if you can find issues that you care about and find other people that share your concerns, make sure you have your information correct, provide some innovative ideas, provide some energy, find the elected representatives that you think are doing the right thing and help them, give them praise, tell them when they're doing the right thing, tell them that you expect more if they're not doing the right thing. So I think this is a real opportunity where it's both a time of great urgency, but also hope. We have a lot of the tools in hand. We know that it's possible to reduce emissions faster. We know it's possible to reform fisheries. We know it's possible to do better at protecting biodiversity. We're just not doing it at the pace and at the scale that's needed. And so that's partly an attitude of, it's a question of awareness, and it's a question of willingness to change. So we need all of you guys to work with those of us that really care about these issues and make some of these changes happen. So instead of just getting frustrated with my generation, you can say, okay, we're going to help make the changes that we think are needed. And you guys are all really well informed. You're learning a lot.
See, our school has lots of awareness about environmental protection and stuff. I don't think anybody in our school at least doesn't believe in climate change. And we're actively bringing up these topics during like dinners. We talk to our families about it and we try to make them listen. And also when we can, we reuse all of our water bottles, and many of us bring these reusable ones. Our school just installed, we used to have like a water fountain, and then people would just take it, but now we have like this special one that only allows you to like refill the ones that you have. And so we're trying to do little things.
So those little things add up, and they can also not only make a difference, but give you things to talk to your families about. And I really like that point, because your power is not just talking to your peers, but also influencing other people that you know. And it's not always easy, as you mentioned. Sometimes you and your family may not see eye to eye, but don't give up on them. Keep having those conversations. Just find a different way. And eventually, I have 5 sisters. And yes, so some of my sisters were not really very environmentally conscious for quite some time, and they are now. They have come around, but not because I said to them, "Shame on you." It was more that we would have conversations, and just something simple like recycling. And one sister told me, she said, "This is too much trouble." And then her kids said, "Mom, we need to recycle." So, you can have influence on your parents. You also have, you're all very adept at social media, I'm sure, and you can use that as a way to communicate with and work together with other people. You can have an influence that way. You have to figure out how to be smart about it. And you have to make sure that the information that you have and that you're passing on is accurate, because that's one of the problems. So make sure you have good sources of information.
My name's Bob.
So before we start, could you just Tell me a little bit about yourselves.
I can just
My
answer
name
your
is
questions
Amy,
or
and I'm in grade 11.
about what I see the big problems are.
I guess
So
I like
really
K-pop.
very big problems are climate change,
I'm
caused by
Trey,
humans,
and I'm 11th
and
grade,
loss of
and I was born
biodiversity,
in
destruction
Japan
of forests,
when I was 9
destruction of
years
coral
old.
reefs,
I went for
etc.
my high school 2
Both
years
of these
old,
two big issues, human-induced climate change and loss of biodiversity,
My name is Michelle.
basically threaten food security, water security, human health. So they're big, big challenges basically. And governments around the world have agreed in Paris to try and limit these so-called greenhouse gases. They've also agreed here in Japan the Aichi target to protect biodiversity. And then the United Nations, literally all governments of the world, agreed that there should be things called sustainable development goals.
So what kinds of questions would you like me to
So it's a big challenge.
respond to?
To me, they're the big issues.
Well,
So,
I was reading the
would you
press
like to ask questions?
release yesterday, and I came across the UN Sustainable Development
Goals?
goals, and goal 13 clearly states that sorry, I'm going to read this. Take urgent action to combat climate change and its impact, but this doesn't seem to be
Then I did a PhD at London University
clear in
chemistry, and it was what we call
China's point of view, because for years now China has been the most popular country in the world, and I haven't seen a dramatic change in China for a long time now. So I'm wondering how countries and nations are planning to work towards China's improvement.
So, later, when we're together as a group, we can give you a more detailed answer. But actually, China is doing more than it's getting credit for. And the United States and China actually did a joint agreement on climate change, going into the climate convention conference in Paris. And that was one of the things that actually made it possible for everybody to come to an agreement. So China is, I think, the largest manufacturer of solar panels in the world. It is still using a lot of coal, but it's also trying to reduce the amount of coal.
I shared probably a dozen very, very large international assessments. And so while I don't do my own personal research, I work with the very best scientists in the world to assess what do we know. So at the moment, I used to chair this thing called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to advise governments what was happening to the Earth's climate. I then chaired one on agriculture, so how can we feed the world? The next one was effectively why are we losing biodiversity, why are we losing our forests, our coral reefs? And I now currently chair something called the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And again, so this is the last one I will share. We have about 1,000 scientists working with me.
They also have
127 governments
and if there is some country like maybe
so it's basically
Cambodia in the future,
the
they're
government
developing their
why are we
economy
losing
and
our
also
forests,
pollution
why are we
happens.
losing our
But
coral?
at that time,
What does
the
it
word
mean
is
for
kind
us
of
as
like
humans?
for pollution and
What
like
does it
pollution
threaten
again and
security?
again,
Does it
and
threaten water security?
that's
So,
gonna be
so most of my
and
career
I'm really curious about
as a
if
science
there is any
advisor,
future
I
research
think
about
government is I chair these very, very
Too often, it has been assumed that the only way you can get to a reasonable level of development is through pollution in the process, and that's not actually the case. And
in fact, it's not just advising
if
government.
anybody did the economics properly
What's
and look at the loss of productivity from people with respiratory illness because of air
So
pollution,
we identify what the problems are.
they would try and avoid
What
pollution as
sorts
much
of
as
policies and technologies
Yeah.
solve the problem. We don't tell
they can. And
governments
it
what
gets
to do.
really bad
We just tell them what options they should at least consider.
All the developed countries, like the United Kingdom or the United States or whichever one you want to pick, they all had a period when there was a lot of pollution. In fact, there was one, it's even up on the board over the timeline over there, there was a major air pollution event in London in 1952, which killed thousands and thousands of people. And that was a big wake-up call for everybody. So I think one of the things that the developed countries can do to help the developing countries is to sort of help them find cleaner ways to develop. Because when you're really back towards the development starting line, it's not easy to get started. And I think that's part of what the Sustainable Development Goals are about. So in every country is subscribed to the Sustainable Development Goals. One of the big challenges actually is the developed countries trying to think about what that actually means for them. And there's hardly a perfect country here, except maybe Bhutan, right?
On the topic of how would a scientist manage to convince large companies that don't have environmentally friendly ways of producing goods if data and statistics point towards global warming isn't enough?
There's a tremendous amount of room for creativity in this sustainable space. And I will give you an example that I was part of since the probably early 1990s, when Shell Oil was interested in exploring for gas in the Peruvian Amazon. And they knew that was rainforest. They knew it was Amazon. They knew that those were sort of in the public awareness. Those were things you weren't supposed to mess up. So they came to see me, and I told them the basic things to be aware of. And not to tell you the whole story, because there isn't time, although it's been an interesting story. Maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I actually flew over the gas wells that came from that project, in which I had been advising, and in which they actually put in without building a single road. And today they're just little pinpricks in the rainforest, and they're connected by buried pipelines, and it's reforested on top. And so the forest is basically minimally disturbed, almost not disturbed at all. And it turned out to be a little bit cheaper, because it's very expensive to build roads and maintain them. So I think there are lots of solutions like that. I mean, yes, it's gas and it's a fossil fuel, but it's the best fossil fuel, right? So I think there's a lot of room for creativity that isn't going to necessarily be very expensive.
Seeing a shark, or seeing a dolphin, or a seal in an aquarium.
Sorry, you know how I talked about China? So, in general, like, is China improving in their population issue, or is there still a big difference?
So, I mean, China, got really worried about the population problem whenever it was 20 years ago or more, and came up with this very strong, strict policy about 1 child per family. It was mostly a good thing, not entirely, because of some of the ways it was done. But, that's one of the big problems we face. 2 or 3 billion more people on the planet. There are now 3 times as many people on this planet as when I was born. I mean, that's how fast population has grown. And so then the issue becomes, how do you feed 2 or 3 billion more people without destroying remaining nature? And scientists have actually looked at that, and through a combination of better agricultural practice and more productivity, reducing food waste, 30% of all food is wasted, and adjusting diets more to what doctors are telling us we should be eating anyway, right? You can do it without destroying another square inch of nature. Yeah, the world doesn't work by just saying, well, there's the answer, it's going to happen. It's much more complicated to get these things done. But knowing that it can be done, I think there will be a lot of things happening in the right kind of direction. And I should say one more thing to you. So, what is it like to work in a field where every day there's a new problem? Right. I wake up every morning looking at the field as a fresh puzzle. What can I do with this morning's puzzle to make it better? And I think it's the only way you can look at it, because if you get discouraged by the things that haven't gone right, then you won't do anything, and then it will definitely get worse, right? You're going to be making a big difference very soon. So don't get discouraged. You'd be surprised what can happen. And to give you an example, so I first went to the Amazon in 1965, just 52 years ago. It's really big, as big as the 48 United States. And there was only one highway in the entire Amazon. Now I can't tell you how many there are. And it's about 20% gone. There was also only one national park in that entire expanse. It's in Venezuela. Today, more than 50% of the Amazon is under some form of protection, and nobody would have ever dared to dream that. Anybody even suggested 15%. Probably would have been taken to a mental institution, right? So a lot of things can happen. Just keep working at it, keep having a vision, keep learning, finding new opportunities. You can make a big difference, and I'm counting on it. And I see a lot of young people today, really just like you, getting engaged in all of this. And don't forget that when a young person tells an older person they're doing something wrong, they don't like to look stupid, right? Do it politely, but so I remember the big energy crisis of the early 1970s when my children, one of whom is here, told me I was driving too much, and I felt so embarrassed. Right? So they were really pulling my strings, right? And you can pull adult strings. It's moved somewhere else in the rest of the world, and it can become what we call an invasive. Of course.
Why did you choose environmental science as your career?
So the progression was, I was interested in animals. Then I got interested in what we call biological diversity. And my initial idea was I was just going to have a wonderful life going around the world, studying all different kinds of animals and plants and having adventures. Right? But then I began to notice what was happening to it. I was sort of looking for a job, and I ended up being employee number 13 in a tiny little organization called the World Wildlife Fund of the United States. And it was at the very beginning of the 70s, as environment was taking off. And I thought I'd just do it for 2 years and then go back on the science adventure track. But then I began to realize how important it was and how interesting it was. And so I stayed 14 years. And then I went on to do some other things, but I'm still tied in very closely with the World Wildlife Fund.
And the governments do realise that these are 5 big threats.
Sure.
With your involvement in the Paris Climate Agreement, would you say that's the most promising or most effective way to help climate changes on the planet?
The most promising way
to improve the conditions of our planet.
So basically we need to be doing a number of things at the same time. One is protecting the biological resource base of the planet, because our ecosystems are run by biological diversity. We are deeply dependent on biological diversity. But at the same time, biodiversity is very vulnerable to climate change. I've been studying that about 30 years. I'll talk a little bit about it this afternoon, but there's not a place on Earth where you can't see plants and animals changing their timing or their location because of climate change, and then some bigger changes on top of that. So it's really important to keep climate change from getting to be big, to be something more like, I think, 1.5 degrees. And there is a really interesting, unappreciated side of all of this, which is that all this excess CO2 in the atmosphere, which is driving climate change, it all comes from biological origins. Some of it's fossil fuels, which are just ancient ecosystems. That's ancient energy, solar energy trapped by ancient ecosystems and buried in the earth and now being burned and released instantaneously. But the other piece is there's a lot of excess CO2 in the atmosphere from the destruction and degradation of modern-day ecosystems. And tropical rainforests are probably the biggest number in all of that, but it's natural systems everywhere. And to the extent that we can restore those, we can pull the CO2 back out of the atmosphere before it has trapped the heat. So we've got to realize the planet works as a combined physical and biological system and manage it that way. It gets really interesting. In the history of life on Earth, there have been times in the ancient past where there have been really high CO2 levels, and the planet in natural processes actually brought it down to levels like it was before the industrial era started to push up the CO2 levels in the atmosphere. So we know that the planet's capable of it. We just don't have tens of millions of years to wait for the planet to do that. But we can intervene by restoring rainforests, restoring coastal wetlands, restoring grasslands. And when you do all of that, you get other benefits. So forests helping watersheds, better grasslands, better grazing, better coastal wetlands, better fisheries, better protection against storm surge. So there's no shortage of things to be done. You don't have to be a scientist to make a difference. You just have to know enough science to know that whatever you're doing will make a difference.
How much energy do we need?
So you can go into law, you could be a poet, right? Write a popular song, right? There are many, many different ways to make a difference.
So a very, very poor person can't afford to use much energy or buy much food. They just don't have the money to do it. A rich person, middle class person.
Well, I don't know a lot about your school, unfortunately, but I think you could actually, you could do an energy audit of your school to start with.
We actually have a solar
panel.
You're already doing that. That's great.
One of our councils is raising money to install solar panels in our school. But the thing is, I guess it's such a long-term project because it's kind of difficult to raise money for our school. They only have 2 opportunities per year, so I was thinking about a short-term way.
But we have like a free dress day where everyone donates 200 yen. And we collect the money, and the World Council, they give it to us.
Goes into the fund for solar panels.
Why don't you figure out, where the solar panels should come from? And maybe you could go visit the company, and they might even donate them.
Because we never contacted
But seriously, I mean, it'd be a great advertisement for them, right?
Yeah, we never thought of that.
So when you go to them, to say, we want to be energy, wise. We really would like to have solar panels on our school. Will you give us some? When you talk to them, say, we would like to do this not just to make our school operate properly, but we want to get this story out so other people think of doing that. And, if you help us by donating or giving us a big discount, we'll make sure that's part of what people learn. Right? So it's partly, think about putting yourself in their shoes, it's not just doing a good thing, but what it also might do for them.
So there's a lot of what we call female infanticide where magically lots of girls should have disappeared very young.
I guess a related question is about paper, because as a school we know that we use a lot of paper, and we get a bunch of printed sheets, teachers are this thick, and so do you know any ways that we can reduce the amount of paper we use? Because I know we've started using laptops in school, which has helped because a lot of it is e-learning, but apart from that, there's still a lot of paper wasting that is
So I don't like to read on the computer screen. I mean, in more than a couple pages worth, it begins to not actually stick in my mind as well. And I think, in fact, we're beginning to learn that learning from reading in a printed book actually is a different kind of learning than learning from a computer screen. So I think we'll have both forever. So I think the most important thing you can do on the paper side is actually make sure there's a really good paper recycling system. And all that fiber can actually be used multiple times. And then when it comes to a point where it's no longer quite so good for recycled paper, then it can go into organic waste streams, right? And be used in improving soils and things like that. So, yeah.
Are there any projects around the world that are currently working towards environment change?
Oh, there are tons of them.
Really? Oh.
There are tons of them.
Are they all successful, or?
No, sometimes, some are more successful than others. So back in 1992, there was this major meeting called the Earth Summit in Brazil, the largest meeting of heads of state in the history of the world still today. And 3 environment conventions came out of that, one on biological diversity, one on climate change, one on land degradation. And the Global Environment Facility was created simultaneously to provide funding for developing countries to be able to meet some of their obligations under those conventions. So it's been around since 1992. It actually is pretty small. It's like $1 billion a year. But it's made a really big difference. And so if you get on the internet and start poking around and see what it has done and what it is dreaming of doing, it'll give you some ideas, and it'll be, multiple countries around the world, hundreds. So some of that increase in national parks in the Amazon I was telling you about had Global Environment Facility money in it. So, and I'm sure South Africa has had multiple GEF projects. It's called GEF for short, right? So Bob Watson was chair of the science panel for GEF. At one point, I was it for 5 years, right? So it's strong science-based projects and programs. But there, then see what some of the local environmental organizations are doing, whether it's your local branch of World Wildlife Fund or Conservation International or something more in the energy area. You'll find lots is going on. And so never get discouraged about getting that first step, because once you're there, a lot of things will follow. I want you all to grow up and be big troublemakers.
On average, the world is increasing in temperature by a little over 1 degree right now, since earlier. But I was wondering where it has increased the most, because it's an average, but so what areas it has increased the most since before?
So I want to make sure I understand the question. It's about the 1 degree, right? And it's what has made the biggest difference in that?
Some places, I don't know, to make it an average, some places have, I don't know, gone down in temperature, or some places have risen a lot in temperature, and I was wondering where the biggest difference was.
So one of the big worries is about the melting of the permafrost in the Arctic. And it's already started to happen. So that worries a lot of us, is how can you really get that under control? So there are a whole bunch of possibilities out there that need to be explored. One of them is, can you burn coal in a way that no CO2 gets into the atmosphere? I'm on the board of a company which is looking for ways to turn CO2 into valuable products, so people will want to buy them. And CO2 will be in the product, the carbon will be, but it won't be in the atmosphere. So there are things like that. There's all the alternate energy stuff. And then there are things which might mimic natural processes. So if there's a big volcanic explosion, a lot of sulfur gets in the atmosphere, and for 2 or 3 years, the Earth's average temperature is cooler. Once it settles out, temperature goes right back to where it would have been anyway. But it may be that as we try and manage our way through this crisis, that short pulses of sulfates in the Arctic area to slow down the warming there while we try to get the rest of it under control may be an option. I raise it only as a question. I'm not saying we should do that. So there are a whole bunch of things like that that we need to be looking at. And I think we shouldn't go beyond 1.5 degrees. I think the biology of the planet is much too sensitive to do that. If you look at the numbers where we are now, we'll never stop there. But that's looking at the numbers from here, right? And a lot of things can happen in the next years that can make that possible. Just people have to actually think about it as something really important.
Oh, yes.
And you hear a lot of discussion, you know, about 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees. I mean, forget it, right? Those are really crazy numbers. Especially, you know, for a world full of 7 billion people. Right?
Really cared about the environment, cared about social issues.
Anyway, so if I were you, I'd be worried about the pace of change in the right direction. But there's no reason why the change, which is, at the moment is just linear, and will never get us where we need to go at that rate. There's no reason it can't become exponential. So, if that's one idea to get out of this afternoon, it's how do we make it exponential? How do we make it the cool thing to do? Literally cool. Part of the problem, of course, is this. There are people who don't want to believe it because it's just easier for them not to believe it. And you have to deal with those people. Some of them are not willing to listen. So I don't know what you do about those. I've never solved that. But there are others who are. Right? You know, and right now we've got another big hurricane about to hit the United States. And there is no question that these 2 big hurricanes are much stronger because of global warming. Because warm water and warm air makes for a more powerful storm. And the Gulf of Mexico has never been so warm. You don't really need to know anything more. And another thing, this is a really good one to have in your pocket. The last time the planet was 2 degrees warmer, the oceans were 4 to 6 meters higher. I don't think you need to know anything more than that to know that 2 degrees is not a good idea, right?
Guy was incredible.
So another question that might be interesting to you, you know, is I've spent a lot of time working in Washington, D.C. and working all the agencies in government, and but I've also spent a lot of time working in other countries. And I've actually made a really big difference in some of those countries. But the key has been to sort of start by asking, well, how can I help? You may even have a really good idea about what needs to be done. But don't go into your first meeting and in the first 5 minutes put the big idea on the table. Right? So, I mean, you need to get to know people, you need to know how they think, and work through these things together. And then it has the ability to actually work and be sustained and become permanent.
What kind of work do you do in those countries?
Based on what I now know and
What I do is about, you know, conservation of rainforests and things like that. And so you'll see in the talk I give this afternoon, one of the things I did starting in the late 70s was initiate a giant experiment in the middle of the Amazon as a partnership with Brazilians to try and understand what does it mean when you break a forest up into fragments. And basically, we didn't know very much about what fragmenting habitats actually does, because you don't see the results right away, but they're actually really big changes. And so I started this as sort of a joint science project, obviously with important implications for conservation policy. And because this was a joint project, it was as much Brazilian as it was North American. Its results, were embraced. And in fact, even before we had results, the Brazilian government started to make all of its protected areas big because they anticipated the answer was going to be that you need a really big area. And so that stood up, and then some of those PhD students grew up, got their PhD, got grown-up jobs, and all of a sudden, they're head of conservation for the state of Amazonas, which is 2.3 times the size of Texas, right? And all of a sudden they're your colleagues and your friends. So sort of the international aspects of this can be a lot of fun, because you find people like yourselves interested in all of this, and they become your friends and colleagues, right?
As individuals, we can do a lot. So on climate change, we can make sure we don't waste energy. Turn the lights off when we leave the room. Have a fuel-efficient car if one has a car. Use mass transportation.
Time on our Brazil,
Rather than take your own car.
which, as I once said, is half of South America. But another one I spent a lot of time in working with is Costa Rica. And Costa Rica is not a very big country, but it is often at the leading edge of developing countries doing conservation work. And then somebody will say, "Oh, well, it's just Costa Rica; it's a special case." Right? And then a few years later, everybody else is doing it too. And then I once a year go to Australia, and Australia is so far from everywhere else that when somebody shows up there, it's very exciting. And I can say the same thing that some of my Australian colleagues have been saying, and somehow it seems like, oh, that must be true, because he came all this way to say it, right? But in the end, it's so much is about how you say it, and so much is about showing respect for the people you're dealing with and the country you're dealing with. They have to listen to the jungle all night. And they actually, they become sort of intellectually and emotionally affected by that experience. It's like, this really is a living planet. You've just been in the heart of the living planet. And it's not just elected officials. I had the head of Unilever, the big corporation, that was really into sustainability. Had Tom Cruise there, right? If people can just get away from these things for a little bit, take them along, but then you can take a photograph with it, but you don't have to, don't be connected to the rest of the world. be connected to the real world, which is nature, you'd be surprised how effective that is.
Okay, my name's Bob, and so I can just answer your questions, or I can make a few comments about what I see the big problems are. So to me, the very big problems facing the world are climate change, caused by humans, and loss of biodiversity, destruction of forests, destruction of coral reefs, etc. Both of these two big issues, human-induced climate change and loss of biodiversity, basically threaten food security, water security, human health. So they're big, big challenges, basically. And governments around the world have agreed in Paris to try and limit these so-called greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that can cause climate change. They've also agreed here in Japan the Aichi targets, and there's 20, to protect biodiversity. And then the United Nations, literally all governments of the world, agreed that there should be things called sustainable development goals. How to basically eliminate poverty, how to get food security for everybody, how to have healthy lives for everybody, water and sanitation for everybody. So there are these big, big international processes, but at the moment there are a lot of agreements but very little action. So the challenge is how to actually then reduce the threat of climate change, how to reduce the loss of biodiversity, how to ensure that everyone does have adequate food, how to make sure everyone does have clean water, and we all can have healthy lives. So there's some big challenges. So to me, they're the big issues. So would you just like to ask questions?
Before we start, yeah. Bob, could I also ask if you could share a little bit about who you are and what your area of research is?
Yes, sure. I was born in England, did my undergraduate degree in chemistry and physics and maths, a very narrow speciality in England, even as an 18-year-old. Then I did a PhD at London University in chemistry, and it was what we call gas phase chemistry. It was almost how does the atmosphere work. Then I moved to the United States. I did a postdoctoral fellowship at Berkeley in California, just outside of San Francisco. Then I did another postdoctoral fellowship, University of Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. I then set up my own research group at Southern California, University of California Institute of Technology. And then I became involved in managing science. I was only 30, but I started to manage some science for NASA, the space agency. And so really since then I've had two parallel lives. I worked for NASA, the space agency, managing science for about 13 years. Then I worked in the White House with Bill Clinton and Al Gore as Vice President, as a science advisor. Then I moved to the World Bank, where I was the Chief Scientific Advisor in the World Bank. Then I moved to England for 5 years, where I was a science advisor to one of the government departments, the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And then I semi-retired myself a couple of years ago. In parallel to these jobs in NASA, the White House, the World Bank, I've chaired a number of what they call big, large international assessments. So I bring scientists from all over the world together of something called stratospheric ozone, climate change, agriculture and biodiversity. So I've chaired probably a dozen very, very large international assessments. And so while I don't do my own personal research, I work with the very best scientists in the world to assess what do we know. So at the moment, I used to chair this thing called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to advise governments what was happening to the Earth's climate. I then chaired one on agriculture to ask how can we feed the world. The next one was effectively why are we losing biodiversity, why are we losing our forests, our coral reefs, and I now currently chair something called the Intergovernmental Platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And again, so this is the last one that I've been chairing. We have about 1,000 scientists working with me, 127 governments basically are members of this group. So it's basically the scientists advising governments, why are we losing our forests, why are we losing our coals, and what does it mean for us as humans? What does it threaten food security? Does it threaten water security? So, so most of my career has been as a science advisor, either in government, in the US government, in the British government, the World Bank, so more governments generally. And the other job is I chair these very, very large assessments. Typically up to 1,000 scientists at a time work on these documents. So I'm not a deep specialist in any one of them, but I know how to get people to work together to then advise governments. And the private sector. It's not just advising governments, but telling, you know, the world what's happening to climate, why is it happening, what are the solutions, why are we losing biodiversity, what are the solutions. So we identify what the problems are, and then we suggest what sorts of policies or technologies can solve the problem. We don't tell governments what to do, we just tell them what options they should at least consider. So that's a reasonable description of my career.
I think some overwhelmed people, but they have prepared some questions.
Oh, good. Okay, who's going first? There's one thing you should always remember. There's nothing called a stupid question. There are stupid answers, but there are no... And it took me a long while to realise if I didn't understand it, it probably meant someone else didn't understand it either. So any question is a good question.
This might sound like a really basic
No.
question. Like, I have a really very little knowledge about environmental science, but what can we do to convince like businesses, like energy industries, to implement more ecologically friendly systems or input renewable energy sources when there's a risk of losing money or go bankrupt?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. As most of you might know, the way we produce most of our energy in the world today is by burning coal or burning natural gas to produce electricity, or we use gasoline, petrol in cars to make our cars run. And when we burn fossil fuels, coal, oil or natural gas, all three, we put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And that is indeed causing climate change. It's one of the gases, it's not the only gas, but it's the most important gas. And so the way we can avoid climate change is simply we need to move away from burning coal, oil and gas, and we need to use, as you said, renewable energy like wind, solar power, even something called modern biomass, hydropower, where we use the rivers to generate energy. We also, so we have to produce our energy in a clean way, but we also have to use it more efficiently. More efficient cars, move into hybrid cars and electric cars, and Japan's a leader in these technologies. We need to make our buildings more insulated so that again, they don't use as much energy. So how do we convince? I think the basic issue is climate change is happening. There's no doubt it's happening. There's no doubt it's happening because of us, human beings. And climate change threatens food security, water security, human health, and therefore it's in our own best interest that we must change to what I call a low carbon economy. In other words, we move away from coal gas and oil into renewable energies. Renewable energy is getting cheaper. Solar energy is much cheaper than it was 10 years ago. Wind energy is much cheaper. So we need governments to encourage industry to move to these clean fuels. And therefore it needs government action, and it needs the private sector to move, but it needs us as individuals to sort of tell governments, we're concerned about climate change. We want you as governments to take action. We want you to sort of put pressure on the energy companies to produce their energy with renewable energy. So in reality, if we do not address climate change, it will cost us a lot of money. And it'll cost us a lot of money because we'll destroy our agriculture, there'll be human health costs, there'll be water costs, etc. Sea level rise will destroy coastal regions. We'll get more hurricanes or typhoons or cyclones. We've just had one very large one hit America, and we're about to have at least one more hit in the next 24 hours. And these are very expensive. They cost hundreds of billions of dollars. So it's in our own interest to stop climate change. And renewable energy companies will have a big market. So the people that will fight them are the coal industry and the fossil fuel industry. They will lose their markets. So what we have to do is actually work with the fossil fuel industry to show there are some cleaner ways to use some of their products, but it is a challenge. So you're absolutely correct. One of the big challenges is for governments to recognise the challenge, and then for civil society, the public, to try and then work to convince government and industry we want clean energy. One thing that makes it very interesting in Japan is whether or not nuclear power is safe or not. And I got questioned at the press conference yesterday. I personally believe nuclear power does have a role. It won't be the solution to climate change, but in many countries, nuclear power might be about 20% of all of the electricity. There are risks with nuclear power. There's three basic issues. One is you can have an accident like the nuclear power station here in Japan. Secondly, you have to get rid of what we call the dirty fissile, the dirty uranium after you finish the power plant. So how do you have safe disposal of what nuclear waste? And the third is you've got to be very, very careful not to lose any of the nuclear fuel to terrorists who can make little mini atomic bombs called dirty bombs. So nuclear power is a tricky one. It will be used in China, India, USA, Korea, France, England. Will not be used at the moment in Japan again, and also won't be used in Germany. So it's an interesting one. It is a clean energy from the standpoint of climate change, but there are risks with it, like anything else. Okay.
So the question is, why isn't the Japanese government doing anything about it?
I mean, I don't know the details, to be honest. However, there is one big issue where Japan is heavily criticised. Talk about dolphins, and that's whaling. The Japanese government supports, they claim it's scientific whaling, that they're only killing whales to understand whaling, but the rest of the world has banned most whaling. And the two countries that keep fighting the international rules, one is Japan and the other one is Norway. And it's built into their cultures where whale meat was part of the diet in both Japan and in Norway. But the problem is we have a limited number of whales. There's a lot of different types of whales in the world. Equally, I would say we should be very careful of all of the big animals in the seas, not just whales, dolphins, sharks in particular. Many of the sharks are now threatened, again because they're being overfished for shark skins, fins. I mean, to me it's horrible, basically.
I have a question on the loss of biodiversity. When I was researching about biodiversity, I came across the idea, is there anything else that we are doing right now that can solve?
Okay, I'm not even sure I know what the bottleneck effect is. Let me talk generally about biodiversity. There's 5 reasons we're losing biodiversity. The first one is we're converting, changing natural habitat. So we take a forest, we cut some of it down to go to agriculture. Many of the mangrove swamps, especially in Asia, have been drained and turned into shrimp farms. Most of the forests in Europe were destroyed hundreds of years ago to build roads and cities. So by changing a forest or a grassland or a mangrove system, we're basically losing a lot of biodiversity. So the first threat to biodiversity is conversion of a natural habitat into sort of a managed one, like an agricultural farm, a shrimp farm, etc. The second threat is climate change itself, and that is changing the Earth's climate means we're changing temperature patterns across the world, and we're changing precipitation patterns, and we're causing sea level to rise. These changes in temperature and precipitation can affect whether a forest is viable, whether a grassland is viable. Some of the plants will migrate to try and keep pace with climate change. Others just can't, they're stuck. So climate change is a major threat to biodiversity. So we've got conversion, we've got climate change. The third one is pollution, and that is land and water pollution. We put a lot of chemicals onto the land to grow food. Pesticides, fertilizers, fungicides. So lots of chemicals are used to produce food. Those chemicals go into the soil, and then when it rains, they flow into rivers, and the rivers basically can die, they become anoxic, and it flows into the coastal zone. And most of the big bays around the world are now dying because of the amount of chemical. The fourth one is we move species purposefully and accidentally from one place in the world to another. And some of these species, you know, maybe it was a native species that grew in South America, it's moved somewhere else in the rest of the world, and it can become what we call an invasive or weedy species, and it kills the natural species there, especially a large number of fish. People put perch into Lake Victoria in Africa, and the perch kill every other fish there. A new fish have been brought into the US. Sometimes they're brought in for a person puts them into an aquarium or a pond. They don't like them anymore, they throw them into a river, and that is an aggressive fish, and it kills all the natural fish. So this issue of invasive species is a real serious one. And the last one is what we call over-exploitation, and that is a very serious effect in the oceans. Over a third of the world's oceans are what we call overfished. They've taken so many fish out, they're just not viable anymore in certain parts of the world. Probably half of the world is at the maximum. You just can't afford to take many more out. It's not sustainable. And there's a few areas of the world where fishing is still viable. So we have to be very careful not to overfish the world's oceans, and we have been. Jane is one of the world's experts on this, actually. She's a marine biologist and a real expert on it. So over-exploitation is a real serious issue. So now the governments do realise that these are 5 big threats. But what drives them? Well, to be honest, we have more and more people in the world. The world's population has already gone past 7 billion. It'll probably go to 9 billion or 10 billion by 2050. We want more, there's more people, they want more fish, and so we overfish the oceans. So quite often it's driven by the number of people on the planet and their ability to purchase food. I mean, not all people, some very poor people just can't purchase food very easily. So yeah, the governments do realise what the problems are, but they have to control fishery, they have to control the agriculture industry, they have to stop cutting down the forests. And the problem is a very serious one. Why did America and Europe become very rich? And I don't know about Japan, so I can't comment on it. Well, what did we do? We destroyed a lot of our natural forests in the US. We did exactly the same in Europe. England, for example, only has 9% of its land forested. It's the lowest in Europe. Other countries are more like 15%. We use coal, oil and gas to produce our energy. So what we're telling developing countries now, don't use coal, oil and gas to produce electricity or energy, and don't cut down your forests, and don't destroy your mangroves. So the rich countries of the world got rich by destroying their biodiversity and by using what we call cheap fossil fuels. We're now telling countries, don't do it. Now, we know a lot more about technology now, that you don't have to use coal and oil in the same way. But we have to be very careful as rich countries, that we have to recognise that we became rich by destroying our environment in reality. And so when we work with developing countries, we have to recognise what we did, and therefore we have to help them with technology, we have to help them with financing. It's because we did. So there is a moral and ethical issue here as well.
You were talking about population, and I understand there's a huge correlation, probably one of the biggest, between population and its effects on detrimental effects on the environment. And of course we've all heard about China's one-child policy. So what are the alternatives, or should we just keep, because we can't really have a ban on population unless we want to,
No, it's a very, very, very good question. Where we have to be careful is the following. The real issue is how much food do we need, how much water do we need, how much energy do we need. I mean, they're three basic issues that we all need: food, water and energy. So what drives the demand for food, water and energy is two things. It's the number of people and how wealthy they are. So a very, very poor person can't afford to use much energy or buy much food. They just don't have the money to do it. A rich person, or middle class person, which would be a lot of people in Japan, a lot of people in America and Europe, they can afford to buy a lot of food. So the amount of resources we demand is a combination of how wealthy you are and how many people you are. We demand is a combination of how wealthy you are and how many people you are. And so a lot of people have been saying, look, all of this environmental destruction, this is bad because China's growing rapidly, and I'll come back to the one person in a minute. China's growing, Indonesia is growing, India is growing. But the average American, we've got 5% of the world's population, roughly, and we consume 25% of all natural resources: energy, water and food. And so an average American uses more than 10 times the amount of an average Indian. 10 or 15 years ago, we used to use about 10 times more than the average person in China. Now we only use about 3 times more, because China's wealth has grown and their energy demand has grown. So there is a moral and ethical issue. Why should an American be allowed to have 10 times more energy per person than an Indian, or 3 times more than a Chinese person? It's not fair. So there is a moral, ethical issue in here as well. Now, the one-person policy in China, at one level, I like very much what they did, because otherwise they would already have 2 billion people. They really would. However, it had terrible effects. It meant that most families wanted a boy, not a girl. So there's a lot of what we call female infanticide, where magically lots of girl children disappeared very young, the babies. And so it had a really bad effect of basically leading to female infanticide, which is really bad. And now China has an uneven population between men and women. The other thing it's also done, which is not as well known, it's now got a population where you've got more and more older people and less people that are young, who are working to sort of look after the older people. So they've got a real issue of an age imbalance as well. And so there's some good things about it, and there's some bad things. I mean, the question I often used to ask myself in the last, say, 10 or 20 years, would I prefer to be poor in India, which is a democracy, or poor in China, which is not a democracy? And I know which one I choose, surprisingly, and that is to be poor in China. The average Chinese, the number of poor has really decreased. There's very little hunger in China. I don't say they've all got great diets, but most have got food. Very few people die in China from not having food or water. So yes, there's a lot of poor Chinese still. The average person in China has got a lot better in the last 10 or 15 years than the average person in India. So one has got democracy, which is good, freedom of speech, and that's very, to me, I think, I'm sure it is to you, that's very, very important. But it is an interesting issue, actually. So I sometimes look at the world, and democracy is not perfect, but nor dictatorships either. I mean, both have got some real weaknesses, basically. I mean, we've got an American president who's a complete idiot at the moment. I mean, a really bad choice, really bad choice, unfortunately. But he is our president, and he appealed to the worst in Americans. Let's stop immigration. It was anti-immigrants. But America became strong because of immigration. And now he's saying, you know, we don't want all these foreigners. And it's a really bad situation. So democracy has weaknesses as well. So all of these systems have some strengths, all of them have some weaknesses. So I like so coming back to population, we got it right, or the world got it right, in 1992 at what was called the Cairo Conference, so in capital of Egypt. So there was the Cairo Population Conference, and they said there were three things that were essential. One was education of girls, because in much of the world at that time, nearly 30 years ago, boys were being educated, and in many developing countries, girls were not. I mean, that's not been an issue in Japan, US and Europe, but in many developing countries, girls just weren't being educated. They were expected to help their mother at home and carry water, etc. So the first was education of girls. Second one was empowerment of women. And that's still a long way to go. I mean, it really is. I mean, I think if you look in most countries, they're still in balance of say, senior politicians, more men than women. If you look in industry, more men in the most senior positions, more men than women. It's improving, the direction is good. So it's education of girls, empowerment of women, and the third one was access to accept socially and religiously acceptable contraception, making sure that if women didn't want to get pregnant, they had access to contraception, basically. And so they were the three things. And there's no question, in most developed countries now, I'm not sure what the number in China is, most women have less than two children per family. If anything, they've got a negative growth rate, basically. And that's what has to be encouraged. And so what China needs to do, and India needs to do, and what Indonesia needs to do, is to encourage those three principles: education of girls, empowerment of women, and culturally acceptable forms of God. But in some religions, like Islam, the idea of an equal woman is not one that's accepted in Islam. I mean, in Saudi Arabia, for example, women still can't drive a car. It's unbelievable. I mean, truly and utterly unbelievable. And of course, in the Roman Catholic faith, there they also have problems with the whole issue of contraception. So there are some issues. But in general, if you want to have a controlled population, those three principles are a very good starting point. They really are. And when a woman becomes educated and empowered, they don't want a dozen children. 1 or 2 children per family, you know, some have 3, but you don't need a dozen children, basically. So an educated woman and an empowered woman, it then takes care of itself. And that really, in hindsight, it's a shame China couldn't have pushed that approach far more, basically.
Bob, if I could just share some of our context. As an international school, we're actually representatives of 40 different nations on Earth. And so even though many of us live in Japan and sometimes identify as being Japanese, although I think you are Japanese, apart from our guests here, as the students here, we're actually representatives of many different countries of Earth. So we may or may not represent Japan.
Yeah, sure. No, agreed. But it's interesting, religion does have a big culture and religion have a big effect on what one country might do to limit population versus another country. And you know, I'm obviously biased, I'll be very honest. I've got a very Western perspective that we're all equal, that women are at least as equal to men, and often more so, and should be. No, and should be. And when Bill Clinton became president of the United States, his first goal was to have a cabinet, senior members of his cabinet, exactly equal male and female, and he did. And some of those women were absolutely superb, absolutely superb. Let's get away from the environmental issues.
I feel like we've dominated so much. Please ask questions.
My name is Izumi, and I'm from International Christian University, and I'm a master's student there. My question is about your work with the White House, and you were talking about how you were working with the White House, but was that before the Trump administration?
Oh yes, absolutely. Trump wouldn't have me and I wouldn't have Trump. Equally, I would not have worked in the Bush administration. Well, I worked in the Clinton-Gore administration. Democrats, relatively left of centre, not way left of centre, but left of centre, really cared about the environment, cared about social issues. So the president has a science and technology advisor, which was when I was there was a person called Jack Gibbons, and Jack had 4 deputies, one for called basic research, basic science, one for technology, one for international activities, and one for the environment. And I was in charge of the one for environment. So I was the deputy science advisor. And it was great fun because Al Gore really cared about the environment. I worked with all the government departments about how would you spend your money? What would you spend on climate change versus biodiversity versus ozone depletion versus a lot of other issues. So my job was to advise the science behind policy and where should we spend our money at the more macro level. I mean, I didn't get down to individual projects. So it was a real fun time. I would have had a very hard time in either of the Bush administration. The first one, Daddy Bush, Bush Senior, was a reasonably liberal Republican, and I could have worked in his administration. But the younger Bush became more right-wing, and Trump is just ultra-right-wing. And I personally can't work for a government that effectively doesn't care about evidence, doesn't care about issues like climate change, doesn't care about issues like loss of biodiversity. I just can't work for a government.
Just, do you want to translate? Basically, question and people. 人々は生態系じゃなくて生物多様性を保全していくときに関わりを持った方がいいのか、持った方が良くないのかっていう基本的な質問を保全していくために人々はその場所を保全していった方がいいのか、その場所はほったらかしというか保全地域として人が関わらない方にした方がいいのかっていう。
Yeah, both. Yes. As individuals, we can do a lot. So lots of it. With respect to biodiversity, yes, we should not destroy nature, and we should encourage people to replant forests. So there are things we can do to encourage government to have a good forest policy, and that is starting to happen in Europe. As I said, we destroyed most of our forests hundreds of years ago, but we're starting to replant forests. We should clearly, sort of, as individuals, if we buy food, we want it to be produced in the cleanest possible way. So there's lots of things as individuals that we can influence government and we can influence the private sector by our choice of what we buy, basically. So as individuals, there's a lot we can do, and especially in theory, especially in a democracy, if our leaders listen to us. But there is a question now, you know, and the problem is, and it's a fair problem, when you elect a member of the Diet here, or you elect your Prime Minister, the person has, you know, there's lots of things that person, it's what is education policy, what is foreign policy, what's their view on economic growth, what's their view on human health, what's their view on the environment. And so you don't choose a person just for one issue. And quite often the environmental issues are not the highest priority. The highest priority tend to be economic growth, tend to be national security, food security. So it's quite understandable that for many people the environment is not the #1 priority. But this is also where governments have a problem. You have a Department of Agriculture that only cares about agriculture, a Department of Water that only cares about water, a Treasury Minister or an Economics Ministry that only cares about economics, a Transportation Ministry that only cares about transportation, an Energy Ministry. In reality, all of these issues are intercoupled. Climate change depends on transportation, it depends on the way we grow our food, etc. It affects agriculture, it affects human health. And governments have got to learn that while you have different ministries, you need them to work together to solve the problems we've got. So these, what I call these stovepipes things, the only way we can address climate change or biodiversity is to look right across all of the ministries at the same time. And very few governments in the world do that. Very few.
Bob, perhaps we have another 10 to 15 minutes, so maybe
yeah, that might be a good idea. Just, yeah, just get general views and things. Yeah.
Okay. Teaching you to think critically, and thank your teachers. Because they gotta be careful when the teacher's here.
Well, the little bits I've overheard, it sounds like all three tables had a really good discussion. This table was excellent. I heard you make similar comments, and I can see Tom's table, everyone was really interested in the issues. And I think, as Tom and myself and Jane would say, the future is in your hands. And the trouble is, at the moment, there are threats to the environment, climate change, loss of biodiversity, but there are solutions. And as young people, you have to push and push to get the solutions. It's your future. You know, I'm 70 years old. I've got a limited number of life. You've got a whole lifetime ahead of you. And so it's very important that the youth of the world, Japan, every other country in the world, you push your parents to be more sustainable. You get your parents and yourselves to push government that you want to have climate change action, you want to protect biodiversity, and you demand from the private sector sustainable goods, efficient cars that don't pollute, make sure the food is sustainably produced. So your voice is incredibly important. If we continue the way we're continuing, we've got a disaster. But the solutions are there. In other words, you should be upbeat. There are solutions. We just need to implement them. And your voice will really, really make a difference, basically. Certainly at many of these big international conferences, which were as boring as hell listening to the governments. And Jane and I have worked for governments, both of us, Jane most recently in the American government. I've worked in both the British government and the American government. So these big international conferences. But quite often now, they will often start with a young person saying what sort of future they want. And I have to be honest, it goes silent when a young person speaks and they talk about the sort of life they want and the vision they have for the earth. And it does have an effect. It takes time, but it does have an effect on most people. Now, unfortunately, it probably won't have an effect on the American president, but it will have an effect on almost everybody else. and we will change our American president hopefully sometime soon, and so hopefully our next president will again listen. The previous president that Jane worked for, Obama, really cared about these issues. He would have been absolutely willing to listen to young people, to hear their aspirations, etc. So your voice is very, very... Do not get disillusioned that we're making progress. Not fast enough, but we are making progress. Jane, do you want to make a couple of comments, and then Tom?
Everything that Tom just said, we've had the same conversation. And instead of my repeating what you said, I'd like to ask one of the students from our table to just share some thoughts, not necessarily everything we talked about, but if you would like to stand up and just speak from your heart about how you're thinking about your future and some of the challenges that we talked about, and any new ideas you've gotten from our conversations.
Okay, so a lot of us at this table were frustrated at the slow rate of change that like governments and organizations are taking, and so we talked also a lot about how as young people and as students we have lots of power to influence the people around us, to implement our beliefs in our actions, and to basically start with change on a small scale and work up. And we also talked about how to deal with people who don't believe in climate change. And Jane provided us with some very insightful advice about focusing on the values and what people really care about instead of on the stats and the science, which doesn't work on all people, because talking about what we all believe in and what we all are interested in is what's going to strike most deeply in people's cores, in their hearts, and affect their decisions. And then we also talked more about fishery and developing countries and a bunch of other topics, but yeah.
Anybody else want to add something? That was a really nice summary. Okay? Tom? I primed the pump.
Yeah, I could tell. So would one of you like to talk about the solar panel project?
Well, we kind of talked about how we'd be able to implement ways to help the environment within our school, and we described the solar panel project that has already started in our school, where our World Council is collecting money to go towards installing solar panels in our school. And he gave us an idea of actually approaching companies that have solar panels and appealing to their marketing, I guess, and having them, telling them that like, giving us solar panels like either at a discount or for free would help their image, and also like push forward the idea of solar panels, which is to conserve energy.
Smart. I have to say just how energized I have been from our conversations. We ran the gamut of topics at this table and shared frustrations, but also shared a lot of excitement about things that are happening, things that are working. I'm impressed with how smart the conversations were, how informed they were, by the critical thinking. So congratulations to you, your colleagues, but also to these kids and to their parents and families. There's a lot of passion here, and I think there is a lot of interest in finding ways to accelerate the pace of progress, and this is what gives me hope. I see the challenges that we have, and I see that there are solutions. We're not using them at the scale or the pace that we need, and what's really needed at this time more than ever before is an infusion of energy and passion and thought for the future that you guys bring. So it's very exciting. I'm energized by this conversation, and I'm really feeling more hopeful because of that. We have great expectations for you guys, and we stand ready to partner with you. You're not on your own. There's a lot of people who would be willing to work together. And you have wonderful opportunities ahead of you, but you have to seize the moment and really make it work. So thank you for really fantastic conversations and lots of new energy.
Does anyone at this table want to say
somebody
anything?
here, not him, but
Yeah, not him. Would any one of you like to make a few comments? Like the other table? Who's going to go? Go. Go on. Go on.
I'm really bad at summarizing like them, but we talked about how environment is not, might not be the government's first priority, which is why it's really hard to address the issue to governments and make them believe in this critical issue. But so he talked about how there are different, what is it called?
How the different governments are stovepipe. Department of Water, Department of Energy, Department, and they don't talk to each other.
Yeah, so that really separates each one of their connections, and that it's really important to connect them together, and that it is really important to work together towards not just for environment but for others, because these environmental issues are really related to agriculture, transportation, economic growth, and everything. So, yeah, it is really important to work together.
So, Tom, did you want to make a last couple of comments or not?
Well, why don't I repeat some of the stuff that we talked about here? And we touched on a lot of the things we've already been sharing. I talked a little bit about what it's like to work internationally and how important it is to listen. And even if you have the ideal solution in your mind, don't start with that. Try and find out what people are thinking and have a conversation that gets you to a point where maybe that idea is a sensible thing to have on the table. But I also talked about just how important it is to take people out and give them the experience with the natural world. Because that makes it real in a way that no computer screen, no page on a book will ever do. And just smelling it, feeling it, listening to it, just sharing the sheer wonder of it can really change people. So I hope you will all be ambassadors for nature and a better environment, and I'm sure you will be.
So, yeah. So,
can I
just
take a moment too? Sorry to interrupt.
Please.
I just wanted to thank you all for coming and sharing your experience and time with us today. I know there's a wealth of experience and a huge background that you all share, and I think I can speak for myself, but also my students here, that they're going to be taking so much of this away with them for not just today, but many days to come. And our school represents 40 nations on Earth, and many of the women here are going to spread out across the planet and become future leaders, become the future voices. And they need to carry these messages with them in their minds and in their hearts into the future. And I really appreciate you taking the time to share these ideas with us.
But it was our pleasure. I think Jane said it. We get as much out of these. Hopefully you got something out of the conversation. We get a lot out of it. It was our pleasure to be able to do this today. Right. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
I think our role is to work towards the future and really think about what changes we can make. Yeah.
It's very nice.
Thank you. To add on to her, I think that because we are the next generation, we will be like the new CEOs, the new presidents, the world leaders. It has like there is no other way, but it will fall on us to take charge of the environment because the older generation will retire and we will be the ones taking control of the environmental situation, and we'll be the ones who will be heading business. So it will be in our hands to put towards the direction of saving the environment.
Well, I also think that if there isn't in the future, I mean, our generation, I feel like people depend on us to make a change, and if we're not there, then there's probably not going to be a change in the future. So we should work towards a goal
and spread more awareness.
Yeah. Really important to educate people on the issues because if people aren't educated, then it will be really difficult to make change. So as long as we're able to make everybody aware of the environment and how important it is to conserve it, then there will be more support in helping the environment.
Speaking for all of us, we believe that if we all come together and really make at least one step towards protecting the environment, we can make a huge change. So we can start small scale, as other people have talked about, and then move to a larger scale project and kind of prevent the world from actually being destroyed. Because right now, as we've heard in the news and everything, we're losing our biodiversity. So yeah, we just have to come together and encourage the governments to understand and hear our voice, because we need to protect our future generations as well.
I think it's really dependent on us because we are the younger generation, and it's basically all in our hands. And in our lifetime, at least once, we're going to encounter some people that don't agree with us in terms of climate change or the detrimental effects that humans have on the environment. And I think it's just really important to keep educating and raising awareness to what humans are actually doing and what the effects are on the environment. Keep reminding everyone that in the long run, it's better for all of us if we shift our attention towards these issues.
I think our generation is kind of upbeat, as Jane said, because we already have possible solutions that we can make use of and implement them later. It's just that I think communication is also one of the key roles to do. So I think it's just that we have to make sure that we use those solutions that we came up with and keep that solutions going.
To add on to that, to everyone, I think the education is a key to really address this issue, but I think to some extent this issue has been addressed to children and the government, but then it's really hard for them to actually believe in this problem, and so we really have to think about a better method to efficiently convince them for this issue and how we should act upon.
Yeah, it's very good answer.